The Great Pyramid of Giza contains roughly 2.3 million limestone blocks, each weighing an average of 2.5 tons. It took approximately 20 years to build, using tools made of copper, which is softer than a modern penny. The workers who built it weren't slaves. They were taxpayers. Tonight, we're stepping onto the Giza Plateau 4,500 years ago, where the Nile has swallowed your farmland, the state has generously offered you employment, and your job is to drag stone blocks up sand ramps until your shoulders bleed and your lungs turn white with dust. You're not building a tomb. You're building the world's most elaborate unemployment program, and the price of your rations is your body. Settle in. Grab something warm. And try not to think too hard about how many of these systems are still running today, just with better marketing. You wake up before dawn, and your back already hurts. This isn't the kind of ache you can stretch out or walk off. This is the deep structural complaint of a spine that spent yesterday hauling limestone and knows it will spend today doing exactly the same thing. Your shoulders throb where the ropes bit through the linen padding. Your hands are stiff, the calluses cracked and tender. You haven't opened your eyes yet, and you're already exhausted. Welcome to your third week as a pyramid laborer. You're not a slave. This is important to understand because the distinction matters to everyone except your body. You're a farmer. Or you were, until the Nile did what it does every year and flooded your fields into a muddy soup that won't drain for months. Back home, your family would be sitting in your house watching the water rise, slowly starving because you can't plant and you can't harvest and you have nothing saved because the last harvest went to taxes. The state takes its share first. Always. But here's the thing about the state. It takes, but it also gives. And what it gives during flood season is this: work. The pharaoh, living forever in the grace of the gods, requires a tomb befitting his eternal majesty. Specifically, he requires a mountain of limestone assembled by human hands on a plateau overlooking the Nile. And since you can't farm and you owe labor taxes anyway, and the alternative is starving in your flooded house, you've been graciously recruited to help build it. You're being paid. Not in copper or gold, nothing so abstract. You're being paid in bread, beer, onions, and the continued existence of your family. The state feeds you better here than you eat at home. The bread is fresh, baked in ovens that never cool. The beer is thick and nutritious, almost a meal itself. You get meat on festival days. Your children back in the village are receiving rations too, delivered by the same bureaucracy that recorded your name and assigned you to a work gang. The mud brick barracks around you hold 200 other men in the same situation. Farmers, craftsmen, laborers, all pulled from their flooded villages and deposited here on the edge of the desert to perform their sacred duty to the two lands. You can hear them stirring now, coughing, groaning, the collective sound of bodies that have been used hard and face being used again. You sit up on your reed mat. The air is already warm, even before sunrise, carrying the faint grit of limestone dust that coats everything here. Your throat feels like you swallowed sand. Your lungs rattle when you breathe too deeply. Somewhere outside, a foreman is shouting the day's assignments. Copper tools need sharpening. Blocks need cutting. The pyramid needs building. You stand and everything hurts, and you shuffle toward the door to begin again. The walk from the workers' village to the pyramid site takes about 20 minutes, and every step of it is designed to remind you of your insignificance. You emerge from the barracks into pre-dawn twilight, the sky a bruised purple above the desert. The air is cool enough to be almost pleasant, a brief mercy before the sun begins its daily assault. Around you, hundreds of other workers are shuffling in the same direction, a river of exhausted humanity flowing toward the plateau. Nobody speaks much. Conversation requires energy, and energy is rationed as carefully as bread. The path is packed sand, worn smooth by thousands of feet over years of construction. It rises gradually as you approach the Giza Plateau, and with each step the pyramid grows larger against the sky. You've seen it every day for 3 weeks now, and it still doesn't make sense. The Great Pyramid, even unfinished, is the largest structure you've ever encountered. It's the largest structure anyone has ever encountered. From this distance, it looks like a geometric wound in the horizon, a perfect triangle of pale limestone that seems to glow faintly in the gathering light. As you walk closer, the scale becomes harder to process. Your mind keeps trying to shrink it, to fit it into the category of buildings you understand. It refuses. The base alone covers an area that could hold your entire village several times over. The sides rise at an angle so precise that the scribes claim it was calculated to match the rays of the sun. You don't know if that's true. You do know that somewhere near the top, tiny figures are already moving, silhouettes against the brightening sky. Men like you, dragging blocks up ramps that spiral around the structure like the coils of a sleeping snake. The sounds reach you before you arrive. Copper on limestone, a rhythmic chinking that never stops. 4 men shouting counts. The groan of wooden sledges being dragged across sand. And underneath it all, the human noise. Thousands of voices merged into a constant murmur of effort and exhaustion. You pass other work gangs heading to their assignments. Each gang has a name painted on their equipment, shouted as a chant to coordinate their pulling. You see the Friends of Hufu, one of the prestigious gangs that works on the upper levels. You see the Drunkards of Menkora, who got their name from a legendary incident involving stolen beer and a misplaced block. Your own gang is called the Southside Haulers, which lacks poetry but accurately describes your function. The organization is overwhelming. This isn't construction. It's a machine made of people, thousands of components moving in coordination. Every action planned and recorded by scribes who care nothing for your name but very much about whether you moved your assigned quota of stone. The mathematics of it are visible everywhere, the precise angles of the ramps, the standardized sizes of the blocks, the calculated spacing of the work crews. 2.3 million blocks. 20 years. And somewhere in that equation, your bleeding shoulders and dust-filled lungs. The sun crests the horizon as you reach your station. The pyramid's shadow stretches across the plateau like a god reaching for the Nile. Time to work. The limestone quarry is a wound in the earth, and you're about to climb inside it. It opens in the plateau about half a mile south of the pyramid, a gaping excavation that descends in step terraces toward the bedrock. From above, it looks like something took enormous bites out of the ground, which isn't far from the truth. Thousands of blocks have been torn from this pit, each one leaving a rectangular scar in the white stone. The walls are lined with these scars, a grid of absence that maps 20 years of extraction. The quarry is where blocks are born, and it's where your body begins to die. You descend the rough-cut stairs into the pit, and the world changes. The air is different down here, thick with limestone dust that hangs suspended like fog. It coats everything, a fine white powder that settles on your skin, your hair, the inside of your nostrils. By midday, you'll look like a ghost. By the end of the season, you'll cough like one. Your tools are waiting at the base of the stairs, laid out by the night crew who maintains them. You pick up your assigned kit and feel your stomach sink. The copper saw blade is already dull. Copper is a soft metal. This is not a design flaw anyone can fix. It's simply the nature of the material. Bronze would be better, but bronze requires tin, and tin is expensive and rare. So you work with copper, which means your saw blade will lose its edge after a few dozen cuts, requiring constant resharpening at the grinding station. The blade is about 2 feet long, set in a wooden frame, and the teeth are already worn smooth from yesterday's work. Beside the saw sit your other implements of slow destruction. Wooden wedges, innocuous-looking pegs that will be hammered into drill holes and soaked with water until they expand and crack the stone. A bow drill for making those holes, its copper tip already showing wear. A copper chisel for detail work. Rope made of twisted papyrus fiber, rough enough to shred your palms if you grip it wrong. The foreman appears, consulting a limestone tablet covered in hieratic script. He assigns your crew to a fresh block in the northwest corner of the quarry, marked with red ochre to indicate its designated size. Standard dimensions: 2.5 tons when extracted. Nothing special. You gather your tools and walk toward your fate, feet crunching on the limestone chips that cover the quarry floor like strange snow. The dust is already finding its way into your lungs with every breath. Around you, other crews are working on their own blocks, the sound of copper on stone creating a rhythm that will follow you into your dreams. The block is waiting. It's still part of the bedrock, still connected to the earth that formed it millions of years ago. Your job is to separate it from that earth using tools that are barely harder than the stone itself. You run your hand along the surface. It's surprisingly smooth, cool in the morning shadow. By afternoon, it will be hot enough to raise blisters. You raise your saw and begin. Cutting limestone with copper tools is an exercise in patient brutality. The stone doesn't want to yield. Why would it? It's been sitting here, undisturbed, for longer than humans have existed. It formed at the bottom of an ancient sea, layer upon layer of compressed shells and sediment, slowly hardening into the pale rock that now surrounds you. It has no particular interest in becoming a pyramid block, and it expresses this disinterest by resisting every cut you make. The process begins with marking. Your crew's scribe has already outlined the block's dimensions in red ochre, crisp lines that define the rectangular prism you need to extract. The block is roughly 5 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 2 feet tall. Standard dimensions, optimized for transport. The mathematics have been worked out by engineers who will never touch a saw. You start on the top cut, the horizontal channel that will eventually separate the block from the massive stone beside it. The saw fits into a shallow groove chiseled by the night crew, and you begin the motion that will define your entire day. Pull, push, pull. The copper teeth bite into the limestone, grinding rather than cutting. Sand is poured into the groove as an abrasive, helping the soft metal chew through the harder stone. The sound is indescribable. A high-pitched scraping that sets your teeth on edge, punctuated by the gritty crunch of sand being pulverized between metal and rock. After 10 minutes, your arms are burning. After an hour, they've gone numb. After 3 hours, you've cut about 2 inches deep into a groove that needs to be 18 inches before you're finished. Your crew works in rotation. 4 men on the saws at any time, switching out every half hour to prevent complete exhaustion. The men not sawing are either drilling wedge holes along the bottom cut or hauling water and sand for the abrasive mixture. Nobody rests. Resting means falling behind quota, and falling behind quota means reduced rations. The copper blade needs resharpening every 30 minutes. You carry it to the grinding station, where specialists work pedal-driven whetstones in an endless cycle. The weight costs you 15 minutes of sawing time, which you'll have to make up later. The blade comes back marginally sharper, enough for maybe 20 more cuts before the teeth are smooth again. By midday, the top channel is finished. Your hands are raw where the soft frame rubbed against your palms. The calluses you developed last week have torn open, leaving angry red patches that sting when sweat drips into them. Now comes the hard part. The bottom cut requires undercutting the block, sawing a horizontal channel beneath it to separate it from the bedrock. This means working in cramped positions, lying on your side in the debris of your own cutting, breathing air that is more dust than oxygen. The saw doesn't fit as well at this angle. The abrasive sand keeps falling out of the groove. Your shoulder screams against the unnatural position. But there's another method, and by late afternoon, you're ready to use it. The drill holes are complete, a line of cylindrical pits along the bottom edge of the block, each about 3 inches deep. Into each hole goes a wooden wedge, dry and tight. Then comes the water. You watch as men pour Nile water over the wedges, soaking them thoroughly. The wood is acacia, dense and strong, and it drinks the water eagerly. Over the next few hours, as the wood expands with absorbed moisture, it will exert enormous pressure against the walls of the drill holes. The stone, rigid and unyielding, has no way to accommodate this pressure. Something will have to give. The crack, when it comes, is one of the most satisfying sounds you've ever heard. It starts as a subtle ticking, almost inaudible under the noise of the quarry. Then a sharp report like a branch breaking, and suddenly a fracture line appears along the bottom of the block, connecting the drill holes in a jagged path. The stone separates from its mother rock with a grinding sigh, settling slightly as it becomes its own entity for the first time in geological history. Your crew cheers, exhaustion briefly forgotten. The block is free. 2.5 tons of limestone, ready for transport. Your hands are bleeding. Your lungs are full of dust. And tomorrow, you get to do this again. The limestone dust doesn't just coat you. It colonizes you. By your 3rd week on the plateau, you've stopped noticing the fine white powder that covers your skin. It's simply part of your body now, a second layer that cakes in the creases of your joints, fills the whorls of your fingerprints, turns your eyebrows pale. When you sweat, which is constantly, the dust mixes with the moisture to form a gritty paste that dries into something like plaster. At night, you scrape it off your arms in flakes, revealing the raw, irritated skin beneath. But the skin is the least of your problems. The dust you can see isn't dangerous. It's the dust you can't see that's killing you. Every cut of the saw, every strike of the chisel, every footstep on the quarry floor sends microscopic particles of limestone into the air. These particles are too fine to settle quickly, too small to be filtered by your nose or caught by your throat. They drift invisibly into your lungs, deep into the branching passages where air meets blood, and they stay there. Limestone is calcium carbide, chemically similar to chalk. It doesn't dissolve in lung tissue. It accumulates. You've developed the cough. Everyone does, sooner or later. It starts as a tickle in the back of your throat, a persistent irritation that makes you clear your throat a dozen times an hour. Then it becomes productive, bringing up white-tinged mucus that looks disturbingly like you're expelling the stone itself. By the end of flood season, the cough will be a permanent companion, a rattling wheeze that wakes you at night and never quite goes away. The veterans, the men who've worked 3 or 4 seasons on the pyramid, have voices that sound like grinding stone. They breathe in shallow sips, avoiding deep inhalation that triggers coughing fits. Some of them can't walk up the quarry stairs without stopping to rest. They're not old. They're your age, maybe younger. There are no masks. The concept doesn't exist in any practical form. Some workers wrap linen across their faces, but the cloth either gaps at the edges or becomes so clogged with dust that breathing through it is impossible. You tried it for one morning before giving up. The choice is between ineffective protection and suffocation. The quarry is the worst, but the dust is everywhere. It rises from the ramps where blocks are dragged, from the finishing areas where surfaces are smooth, from the paths where thousands of feet shuffle back and forth each day. On windy days, the entire plateau becomes a white haze, visibility dropping to a few dozen yards, the pyramid reduced to a ghostly presence that looms and fades. The dust reflects sunlight, creating a glare that makes your eyes water and burn. By midday, you squint constantly, the muscles of your face aching from the sustained tension. Some workers develop a permanent squint, their eyelids scarred from repeated irritation. You cough again, tasting the familiar chalk at the back of your throat. You spit, and the saliva is white. The pharaoh's tomb is being built one breath at a time, and some of those breaths are yours. The foreman's name is Mary-Rahashtef, and he serves forces far more powerful than the pharaoh. He serves the quota. You see him approaching across the quarry floor, his copper measuring rod catching the light. He's a compact man weathered by years of desert work, with a voice that carries effortlessly over the noise of the construction site. He doesn't need to shout to be heard. His presence creates its own kind of silence. The rod in his hand is precisely 1 royal cubit long, about 20.5 inches, marked with gradations for palms and fingers. It's the official measuring implement of the 2 lands, standardized by royal decree, and Mary-Rahashtef wields it like a physician wielding a diagnostic tool. He measures your block against the specifications chalked on his limestone tablet. He measures the depth of your cuts. He measures the progress of your mourning against the progress expected. He doesn't beat you. He doesn't need to. The punishment for falling behind quota is elegant in its cruelty. Reduced rations. Not eliminated, never that. A man who doesn't eat can't work, and a man who can't work produces no value. But reduced, certainly. Less bread. Less beer. The slow withdrawal of calories that your body desperately needs to fuel tomorrow's labor. The scribes record everything. They sit in shaded areas at the edge of the quarry, their reed brushes moving constantly across papyrus scrolls, noting the work of each gang in careful hieratic script. Blocks cut, blocks transported, blocks placed. Workers present, workers injured, workers dead. Rations distributed, tools issued, copper consumed in the endless war of soft metal against hard stone. You are an entry in the Pharaoh's eternal bureaucracy. Your name exists somewhere in that mountain of records, associated with a gang designation, a productivity rating, a calorie account. If you died tomorrow, a scribe would note it, adjust the figures, and requisition your replacement from the next village scheduled for labor rotation. This is the genius of the system. You're not forced to work by threat of violence. You're encouraged to work by the architecture of survival itself. The food is here, at the pyramid. Your family receives rations because you're here, working. Fall behind and the system adjusts. Not with whips, nothing so crude. Just with arithmetic. Mary Rahashta finishes his measurements and makes a notation on his tablet. Your block is acceptable. Your progress is slightly behind schedule but within tolerance. You'll receive full rations tonight. He moves on to the next crew without comment. Praise is not part of the system. Neither is cruelty exactly. There's simply the quota, impassive and eternal. The mathematical expression of the pharaohs will made manifest in stone and flesh. You return to your saw and begin cutting again. Somewhere, a scribe writes down another number. The midday meal arrives, and here's where things get complicated. You're being exploited. This is clear. Your body is being used to build a monument that serves the glory of a god king who will never know your name, and the process is slowly destroying your lungs, your joints, your capacity for a normal human lifespan. You understand this in the abstract way that anyone understands the large-scale forces acting upon them. But the bread is really, really good. The bakeries at the workers' village run constantly, their mud brick ovens heated to temperatures that would cook a man as easily as a loaf. The bread emerges in round, flat discs, crusty on the outside and soft within, made from emmer wheat ground fine and leavened with wild yeast. It's better bread than you eat at home. It's better bread than most people in Egypt eat anywhere. The beer is distributed in large ceramic jars, thick and nutritious, closer to liquid bread than anything you'd recognize as alcohol from later periods. It's fermented from the same emmer wheat, unfiltered, packed with proteins and calories that your body desperately needs. 2 jars per man per day is the standard ration. Some days you get 3. The onions are piled in baskets, sharp and pungent, believed to grant strength and stamina. Garlic too, cloves as large as your thumb, prized for the same reasons. You eat them raw, crunching through the fibrous layers, feeling the burn in your sinuses and not minding it at all. On festival days, there's meat. You sit in the narrow strip of shade cast by the quarry wall, bread in one hand and beer jar in the other, and you consider the trap you're in. Back home, during flood season, your family would be surviving on stored grain that dwindles daily. Maybe some dried fish if last year's catch was good. The children would be listless, conserving energy because there isn't enough food to fuel activity. Your wife would be stretching every meal, adding water to the porridge, calculating how many days until the floods recede and planting can begin. Here, you eat better than you've eaten since the harvest feast. The state has calculated this precisely. The investment in calories is not generosity. It's infrastructure. A well-fed worker moves more stone than a hungry one. The bread and beer and onions are converted through the machinery of your muscles into blocks transported into pyramid progress into the pharaoh's eternal glory. You are a conversion mechanism, transforming food into monument. But knowing this doesn't make the bread taste worse. The other men from your crew eat in silence, too tired for conversation, too focused on the calories entering their bodies. Across the quarry, other crews do the same. The midday break is sacred, protected by regulations that understand exhausted workers make mistakes and mistakes damage expensive stone. You tear off another piece of bread, still warm from the oven, and wash it down with the thick, yeasty beer. This is the cruelest part. Not the labor, not the dust, not the endless noise. The cruelest part is that you're grateful. The trap is comfortable, and comfort makes the trap invisible. The block is cut. The block is free. The block weighs 2.5 tons. Now you have to move it. The extraction sledge waits at the base of the quarry ramp, a wooden frame built from acacia timbers, its runners worn smooth by countless previous loads. Your crew maneuvers the block onto it using levers and rollers, a process that takes the better part of an hour and requires the coordinated effort of all 20 men. The block shifts, settles, shifts again. When it finally rests on the sledge, the wood groans in protest but holds. The ropes come next. They're made of papyrus fiber, twisted into cables as thick as your wrist. They're also remarkably good at removing skin. You wrap a length around your shoulders over the linen padding that barely cushions anything and take your position in the pulling line. 9 men on the left rope, 9 on the right, 2 at the back to guide the sledge. The foreman counts. 1, 2, pull. The sledge doesn't move. It sits there, obstinate, 2.5 tons of limestone expressing its preference for staying exactly where it is. The ropes dig into your shoulders. Your feet scrabble for purchase in the sand. 1, 2, pull. A groan from the wood. A slight shift. Nothing more. This is where the water comes in. A crew member walks ahead with a ceramic jar, pouring Nile water onto the sand in front of the sledge. The water changes everything. Dry sand has a friction coefficient that makes dragging nearly impossible. Wet sand, packed and slick, reduces that friction dramatically. It's not quite frictionless, but it's close enough to make 2.5 tons movable by human muscle. The technique was figured out by engineers long before you were born. The mathematics are precise. A certain volume of water per distance traveled, applied at a certain rate, producing a certain reduction in required force. You don't know the mathematics. You just know that wet sand means the difference between possible and impossible. 1. 2. Pull. The sledge moves. The ramp stretches ahead of you, rising at a gentle angle toward the pyramid's base. It's built of sand and rubble, packed hard by years of use, wide enough for multiple sledges to pass. The surface is uneven, scattered with debris, treacherous underfoot. You don't look where you're going. You look at the back of the man in front of you and you pull. The rope finds the places where your padding has shifted, the spots of bare skin that were protected yesterday. It digs in, grinding against flesh, creating friction burns that will weep and scab and scar. By the end of flood season, your shoulders will be a landscape of healed wounds, layers of damage written on your body like rings in a tree. You don't think about that. You don't think about anything. Thinking requires energy you don't have. 1. 2. Pull. The pyramid grows larger with every step, its bulk filling your vision, the unfinished courses of limestone rising toward the sky. Somewhere up there at the current working level, other crews are placing blocks that started this morning where yours started. The cycle is continuous. Cut, transport, place. You will return to the quarry tomorrow and begin again. 1. 2. Pull. The sledge inches forward. Your shoulders scream. The pyramid waits. The workers' medical station is busier than it has any right to be. It's a mud brick structure near the village center, staffed by men who've been trained in the treatment of construction injuries, which is to say they've seen everything and are surprised by nothing. You've visited twice so far, once for a saw blade cut across your palm and once for blisters that became infected. Both times the treatment was competent, even gentle. This is not a place designed to cause suffering. Suffering just happens to be the primary product of the work it supports. The injuries fall into predictable categories. Crushed extremities lead the list. Fingers and toes, mostly caught between shifting blocks or pinched under sledge runners. The sound of a finger being crushed is surprisingly quiet, a muffled crunch that the victim usually doesn't register until they look down and see the damage. Treatment depends on severity. Minor crushes are splinted and wrapped. Major crushes result in amputation performed quickly with copper blades and cauterized with heated metal. Archaeological evidence shows that many of these amputees survived, their bones healing cleanly, their lives continuing minus a digit or two. Rope burns are universal. Everyone who pulls has them, in various stages of healing. The papyrus fibers create abrasions that go septic with alarming frequency, the wound filling with pus and spreading infection into surrounding tissue. The doctors lance these with copper needles, drain the fluid, and pack the wound with honey, which has antibacterial properties that ancient Egyptians understood empirically, if not scientifically. Heat collapse claims several workers per week during the worst of the afternoon hours. Most recover with shade and water. Some don't. The ones who don't are carried to the village and given final rites if death seems imminent. Their bodies are buried in the workers' cemetery, a necropolis of simple graves that stretches along the plateau's edge. Falls happen despite every precaution. The ramps are wide but uneven, the footing uncertain, the loads heavy enough to throw a man off balance. A fall from the upper ramps can be fatal. A fall from the lower ramps typically results in broken bones, which are set and splinted with reasonable skill. You've seen men return to work with legs that healed crooked, their gait permanently altered, their productivity permanently reduced. And then there are the blocks. 2.5 tons doesn't forgive mistakes. A rope that breaks, a roller that slips, a sledge that tips, and suddenly that much weight is moving in an uncontrolled direction. The men caught in its path rarely survive. Your crew lost someone last week, a man named Epi who was positioned at the wrong angle when a guide rope snapped. The block shifted 6 inches. Epi was in those 6 inches. His name is recorded in a scribe's ledger, noted alongside the circumstances of his death and the disposition of his remains. His body rests in the workers' cemetery, close enough to the pyramid to share, in some small way, in the pharaoh's eternal glory. This is presented as a benefit. You try not to think about it too much. Thinking about death doesn't prevent it. It just makes the work harder. You return to your saw, careful with every cut, aware that the next injury could be yours. You don't remember walking back to the barracks. One moment you're releasing the ropes after the block finally, mercifully settled into its designated position on the pyramid's rising face. The next moment you're here, standing in the doorway of the mud brick building that has become your home, swaying slightly, not entirely certain your legs will carry you the remaining 20 feet to your sleeping mat. The workers' village spreads around you in the darkness, a planned community built by the same state that built the pyramid. It's not a camp. It's infrastructure, permanent structures designed to house the labor force for the 20 years this project will require. There are streets, actual streets, laid out in a grid pattern that speaks to central planning. There are bakeries where the bread is made, breweries where the beer is fermented, granaries where the surplus is stored. There's a medical station, a tool maintenance facility, administrative buildings where scribes track the endless data of construction. It's more infrastructure than your home village has ever possessed. You collapse onto your reed mat and the pain arrives. The numbness that carried you through the last hours of work dissolves, replaced by a comprehensive inventory of damage. Your shoulders throb with every heartbeat, the rope burns pulsing with inflamed urgency. Your hands are cramped into claws from gripping the pulling line, the fingers refusing to straighten. Your back, your legs, your feet, everything that bent or stretched or supported weight throughout the day now presents its bill. The cough returns deeper now, rattling in your chest like stones in a jar. You hack into the darkness, tasting the chalky residue of limestone, and the man on the mat beside you coughs in sympathy, or perhaps just in his own suffering. No one speaks. Speaking requires energy no one has. The barrack smells of sweat and dust and the particular exhaustion that accumulates in places where tired men sleep. It's not unpleasant, exactly. It's just the smell of work, the olfactory signature of bodies used beyond their normal limits. you should eat. There's bread and beer waiting in the communal kitchen, your evening rations that the state provides with clockwork regularity. But eating requires sitting up, walking across the room, chewing and swallowing. The tasks seem impossibly complex. The mat beneath you seems impossibly comfortable. Tomorrow, you'll do this again. And the day after. And the day after that, until the floods recede and the planting season begins and you're released back to your farm to grow the crops that will be taxed to feed the next rotation of workers. The cycle is endless, perfectly balanced, a system designed to extract maximum value from your labor while providing just enough benefit to prevent rebellion. You think about your family back in the village receiving their rations because you're here. You think about your children eating bread made from grain you didn't grow, baked in ovens you'll never see. The state is keeping them alive. The state is also using you. Both things are true. The trap is comfortable. The trap has bread and beer and a mat to sleep on. The trap is better than the alternative, which is starving in a flooded house while the pharaoh builds his own tomb with someone else's body. You close your eyes. Sleep comes instantly, dreamless and absolute. Tomorrow, the pyramid waits. Let's be honest with each other. You wouldn't survive this. Not the heat, not the dust, not the endless hours of hauling stone with Bronze Age tools. Not the rope burns or the crushed fingers or the slow accumulation of calcium in your lungs. Not the 14-hour days, the 7-day weeks, the 3-month seasons of labor that ancient Egyptians endured because the alternative was watching their families starve. The modern body isn't built for this. The modern mind definitely isn't. You'd collapse from heat exhaustion on day 1, probably within the first 3 hours. If you somehow survived that, the respiratory damage from limestone dust would catch up with you within weeks. If you somehow survived that, the repetitive stress injuries would cripple you within months. And if you somehow survived all of that, the sheer psychological weight of the work, the endless, pointless, monument-building labor performed under the watchful eyes of scribes who see you only as a number in a ledger, would break something inside you that doesn't heal. The ancient Egyptians survived because they had to. They'd been doing hard agricultural labor since childhood. Their bodies were adapted, their expectations calibrated. Their understanding of normal work shaped by a world where physical suffering was simply the price of existence. They survived because not surviving meant something worse. But here's the thing that matters, the thing that makes this more than just a story about ancient suffering. The pyramids weren't slave labor. The evidence is overwhelming. The workers' villages, the medical care, the quality rations, the competitive work gang names painted proudly on equipment, none of this fits the profile of a slave economy. These were citizens, fulfilling their tax obligations in the only way available during flood season when their farms were underwater. The pyramids were a welfare program. Think about that for a moment. The largest, most enduring structures in human history exist because the state needed to keep its population fed and occupied during months when no productive work was possible. The alternative was millions of idle farmers with nothing to do, growing restless, growing hungry, growing dangerous. The solution was to put them to work on something massive, something that reinforced the state's power, something that kept them too exhausted to rebel. Does any of this sound familiar? The Works Progress Administration built bridges and dams across America during the Great Depression, employing millions who might otherwise have rioted. Military bases locate themselves in economically depressed regions, providing jobs that communities become dependent upon. Infrastructure projects appear with suspicious regularity before elections, creating employment that translates into political support. Sports stadiums receive public funding with promises of prosperity that rarely materialize, but always generate construction jobs. The pyramid is still being built. We've just gotten better at disguising it. You stood on the Giza Plateau 4,500 years ago, your shoulders bleeding, your lungs filling with dust, your body converted into a mechanism for transforming bread and beer into eternal monument. You served a god-king who would never know your name, laboring under a system designed to extract your value while providing just enough benefit to prevent resistance. The buildings are different now. The tools are different. The gods have different names. But the math is exactly the same. Somewhere right now, someone is being kept too tired to question who benefits from their exhaustion. Somewhere right now, a system is being praised for the employment it provides while the monuments it builds serve purposes far removed from the workers who build them. The pharaoh's tomb still rises against the sky. It just looks different now. Rest well. You've earned it. Tomorrow, there's always more stone to move. There is a crystal somewhere in a museum case that supposedly allowed Viking navigators to find the sun through solid cloud cover. It refracts light in a particular way. Scientists have written papers about it. Documentary narrators have spoken reverently about it. And there is almost no evidence that any Norse sailor ever used one for navigation. The sunstone makes for a beautiful story. Sophisticated Scandinavians, armed with proto-scientific instruments and celestial knowledge, charting courses across the featureless Atlantic with mathematical precision. It flatters everyone involved. It suggests that the discovery of Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland was the product of genius rather than desperation. The reality smelled considerably worse. Picture a Nar, the standard Norse cargo vessel. Roughly 50 feet of clinker-built oak, open to the sky, carrying perhaps 30 men along with whatever livestock, supplies, and desperate hopes they could fit. There was no cabin. No shelter from spray. No compass, because compasses would not reach Scandinavia for another 3 centuries. The men aboard stank of sweat, sea salt, fish oil, and the particular terror that accumulates when you have been out of sight of land for 4 days and the clouds have not broken once. These were not scientists. They were fishermen, traders, and farmers who had run out of good options at home and decided that the open Atlantic was preferable to whatever waited for them on shore. Their navigation tools were their eyes, their noses, and the accumulated folk wisdom of generations who had noticed certain patterns in bird behavior. The discovery of Iceland was not a triumph of sophisticated seafaring. It was a practical problem solved by practical men using methods that would make a modern sailor weep. They watched birds. They smelled the air. They noticed when the water changed color. And mostly, they hoped. Hope, it turns out, was the primary navigational instrument of the Viking Age. The gannet is a seabird with a wingspan of roughly 6 feet, a brain the size of a walnut, and navigational instincts that early Norse sailors trusted more than their own judgment. This was not superstition. This was survival mathematics. Gannets nest on land. They fish at sea. Every dawn, they fly away from their colonies toward open water to hunt. Every dusk, they return. A sailor who spotted gannets flying in a consistent direction at sunrise knew, with reasonable confidence, that land lay in the opposite direction. A sailor who spotted them at sunset could follow their path home. This was the actual navigation system. Not crystals. Not star charts. Birds. Puffins worked similarly, though their range was shorter. Guillemots, fulmars, and various gulls all had patterns that experienced sailors learned to read. The presence of certain species meant proximity to specific types of coastline. Absence meant open ocean, with all the terror that implied. Beyond birds, there were subtler signs. Clouds behave differently over land than over water. Ice reflects light upward, creating a pale glow on the underside of cloud cover that can be visible from remarkable distances. Glaciers produce a white shimmer. Forests produce a greenish tint. A sailor who could not see the horizon might still read the sky above it. Wave patterns told their own stories. Open ocean produces long, regular swells. Coastlines interrupt those swells, creating interference patterns that radiate outward. A skilled observer could detect land beyond the horizon by noting subtle changes in how the boat moved beneath him. The sea itself became a map if you knew how to feel it. But all of these techniques shared a common weakness. They required visibility. When the fog came, everything stopped working. The birds vanished into gray nothing. The clouds became indistinguishable from the sea. The horizon ceased to exist. And men who had been navigating competently for days suddenly found themselves floating in a featureless void with no idea which direction would kill them fastest. Fog was not an inconvenience. Fog was where navigation went to die. The North Atlantic produces fog with enthusiasm. Warm air from the south meets cold water from the north, and the result is a gray blanket that can persist for days. Inside it, there is no sun. There are no stars. There are no birds, because the birds have better sense than to fly in conditions where they cannot see. There is only the boat, the water immediately beside it, and the growing certainty that something has gone terribly wrong. Sailors caught in extended fog banks drifted. There was nothing else to do. Rowing was pointless without a direction. Sailing was worse because it meant actively traveling toward an unknown destination that might be open ocean or might be rocks. The safest option was often to lower the sail, ship the oars, and wait. Waiting meant rationing. Water, primarily. A nar might carry enough fresh water for 2 weeks if consumption was careful. Fog that lasted 3 days consumed a fifth of that margin. Fog that lasted a week turned a routine voyage into a survival exercise. Men began calculating how long until the water runs out How long until land, even if the fog lifts now? How long until the decision must be made to drink seawater and accept the consequences? Nadod, credited in the sagas as one of the first Norse visitors to Iceland, was almost certainly not trying to find it. The records suggest he was sailing from Norway to the Faroe Islands, a route that had been traveled for generations. Somewhere in the crossing, conditions changed. Fog, storm, current drift, some combination of factors that the sagas do not specify. When visibility returned, the Faroes were not where they should have been. What was there instead was a coastline covered in snow. Nadod called it Snowland. He did not stay. He turned around and went home, carrying the knowledge that something unexpected existed to the northwest. He had not discovered Iceland through skill. He had discovered it through the specific mercy of fog lifting before his water ran out. Most men who drifted that far were not so fortunate. The ocean did not care about bravery. It did not reward boldness or punish cowardice. It simply killed everyone who took certain routes at certain times and allowed a percentage of those who took other routes to survive. Over generations, this created the appearance of navigational knowledge. The Gulf Stream, that great river of warm water flowing northeast across the Atlantic, shaped everything. Sailors who drifted into its current moved faster than they expected, often overshooting their intended destinations. Sailors who crossed it noticed the temperature change, the shift in water color from gray-green to deep blue. This became a marker, a sign that the crossing had reached a particular stage. But it was not a marker anyone had designed. It was simply a pattern that survivors noticed and survivors' sons remembered. Storm corridors worked similarly. The North Atlantic has predictable patterns of violent weather, bands of latitude where storms are more frequent and more intense. Ships that cross through these bands during certain seasons return less often. Ships that avoided them return more often. Nobody needed to understand the atmospheric physics involved. The mathematics of dead sailors taught the lesson clearly enough. Temperature gradients signaled approaching land. Water near coastlines carries different thermal properties than open ocean. Sailors who noticed the sea growing colder, who felt the air shift from maritime dampness to something sharper, knew that land might be near even if they could not see it. This was not science. This was the accumulated observation of men paying very close attention to anything that might keep them alive. The routes that emerged from this process were not optimal in any engineering sense. They were simply the routes that returned enough sailors to be remembered. The sea selected for survival, and survival became tradition, and tradition became the navigational knowledge that sagas would later credit to individual genius. But the sea kept no records of the routes that failed. Those men simply vanished, and their knowledge vanished with them, and no one ever knew how close they might have come to finding something remarkable. Knowledge was currency, and currency was not shared. A fishing family that stumbled onto rich cod grounds off an unknown coast had discovered something more valuable than the fish themselves. They had found a competitive advantage that could sustain their lineage for generations. Sharing the location would be economic suicide. So they did not share it. They passed the route from father to son in whispered conversations that left no written record. They sailed alone, departed at odd hours, returned with holds full of fish and mouths full of nothing. This was not paranoia. This was standard practice across the entire Norse world. Trade routes were proprietary. Sailing directions were family property. A man who could reliably navigate from Bergen to Dublin and back possessed something his neighbors would pay dearly to learn and would be furious to discover he had taught someone else. The knowledge stayed secret because secrecy had value. The consequences for historical accuracy were significant. Routes that dozens of families had traveled for decades might appear in the written record as the discovery of a single legendary individual. The saga writers knew about the successful voyages that became famous. They did not know about the anonymous fishing runs that had established the routes those voyages followed. They credited the noblemen who arrived triumphantly. They never mentioned the fishermen who had made the same journey 60 years earlier and told no one. This creates a problem when assessing Viking navigational achievement. The heroes of the sagas, the Leifs and Ericssons and Nadods, were almost certainly not the first humans to reach the places they are credited with discovering. They were simply the first survivors wealthy or prominent enough that someone bothered to write their names down. Behind every legendary navigator stood generations of anonymous men who had learned the route through trial, error, and catastrophic failure. The waterlogged shoulders they stood on belonged to men whose names the sea took along with their bodies. Family secrets written in blood tend to stay secret when the blood stops flowing. The image of the Viking longship slicing boldly across open water makes for excellent cinema. The reality involved considerably more sitting around. Norse vessels were sailing ships, which meant they depended on wind. Not just any wind. The right wind, blowing in the right direction, with the right strength for the right duration. A voyage from Norway to Iceland required a sustained westerly or northwesterly breeze. Without it, the crossing was impossible. With the wrong wind, the crossing was suicide. Successful captains understood this deeply. They did not set sail when they felt brave. They set sail when the weather told them to. This meant weeks, sometimes months, of waiting at departure points, watching the sky, testing the air, consulting with other sailors about patterns they had noticed. Impatience was a luxury that dead men had enjoyed. Living sailors cultivated patience like a survival skill. The waiting had its own terrors. Supplies dwindled. Crew grew restless. Families left behind worried. Political situations shifted. A captain who waited too long might miss the sailing season entirely, trapped until the following year. A captain who left too early might find himself becalmed in open water, drifting helplessly as his water supply counted down toward zero. False starts were common. A promising wind that shifted 2 days out. A storm that appeared from nowhere. Conditions that looked perfect from shore, but revealed their treachery once land had disappeared behind. Experienced sailors learned to distrust optimism. They learned to read secondary signs, the behavior of clouds at particular altitudes, the feel of humidity in the morning air. They learned that the sea punished eagerness and rewarded those who were willing to look like cowards until the moment was right. Bravery, in the end, had very little to do with it. The successful navigators were the ones who understood that the Atlantic set its own schedule, and arguing with it was not exploration but execution. For every saga that ends in triumph, there is a colony that ends in silence. The Norse settlement of Greenland lasted roughly 500 years. At its peak, it supported perhaps 5,000 people across several hundred farms, 2 major settlements, and a bishopric that sent representatives to Rome. And then it stopped. The last written record from Norse Greenland dates to the early 15th century. By the time European ships returned in the 18th, they found ruins and graves and not a single living descendant. The causes were multiple and overlapping, but climate sits at the center. The medieval warm period had made Greenland's southern coasts viable for the cattle-based agriculture that Norse settlers practiced. When temperatures dropped, the grass failed. The cattle died. The trade routes that had connected Greenland to Iceland and Norway became longer, harder, more frequently fatal. Ships that once made the crossing reliably began vanishing with increasing regularity. Vinland, the legendary settlement on the North American coast, lasted even less time. The sagas record a handful of expeditions, some successful trading, considerable conflict with indigenous populations, and then nothing. The logistics of distance had exceeded the rewards of presence. The voyage was simply too long, too dangerous, and too expensive to sustain a permanent colony for the sake of timber and grapes. The mathematics were brutal. A nar could carry perhaps 30 tons of cargo. The crossing to Vinland took weeks under favorable conditions, months if conditions turned. The water calculation, always the water calculation, limited how long any vessel could stay at sea. Every mile of distance reduced the margin for error. Every day of adverse weather consumed supplies that could not be replaced. The Viking expansion had hard material limits. It reached the edge of what open boats and dead reckoning and bird navigation could sustain, and then it stopped. Not because the Vikings lost their courage, because the ocean took back what the ocean had briefly allowed. The sagas remember Nadod, who found Snowland. They remember Floki, who found Iceland and gave it the name that stuck. They remember Leif, who found Vinland and became a hero. They do not remember the fisherman who found Iceland 30 years before Nadod and drowned on the way home. They do not remember his crew or his boat, or the route he might have established if he had survived long enough to sail it twice. Survivor bias is not a modern concept. It is simply what happens when the only people who can tell stories are the people who live through them. The historical record of Viking navigation is a record of success, because failure left no witnesses. The men who pioneered routes and died before sharing them contributed nothing to the written tradition. Their knowledge sank with their ships, settled on the Atlantic floor, and rotted into anonymity. This distorts everything. Every named discoverer in the Norse tradition was, by definition, someone who made it home at least twice, wants to find the place, and wants to tell someone about it. The first human beings to see Iceland were almost certainly not the first human beings credited with seeing it. They were simply the first survivors prominent enough to be remembered. The pattern repeats beyond the Viking Age, beyond navigation, into every field where innovation is credited to individuals. The inventor whose name attaches to a breakthrough is rarely the first person to have the idea. They are the first person to have the idea and survive long enough to document it, promote it, defend it. Behind every Edison stand rows of anonymous tinkerers whose workshops burned down, or whose patents were stolen, or whose lives ended before their work could be recognized. The Norse sailors who found Iceland were brave and skilled and lucky. The ones who found it first were probably braver, possibly more skilled, and certainly less lucky. Their boats rest somewhere beneath the gray Atlantic swells, carrying secrets that no saga will ever record, routes that no descendant will ever sail. The sea keeps its own counsel, and the dead keep their silence forever. On the 13th of October, 1307, just before dawn, royal agents across France broke down the doors of Templar commanderies with arrest warrants that read like fever dreams. The charges were spectacular. The Knights Templar, defenders of Christendom, protectors of pilgrims, heroes of the Crusades, stood accused of spitting on the cross during secret initiations, of worshipping a mysterious idol called Baphomet, of conducting obscene rituals that involved kissing each other in uncomfortable places, of renouncing Christ in candlelit ceremonies. And buried among these theatrical accusations, almost as an afterthought, was something else. Something about money. The warrants mentioned that Templars controlled vast wealth through mysterious means, that they moved gold across borders without explanation, that they held power over kings through debts no one could track, that coded letters passed between their houses carrying secrets about finances that no honest Christian organization should possess. King Philip IV of France, the man behind these arrests, was deeply in debt to the Templars. A suspicious person might notice this coincidence. A cynical person might find it illuminating. But here is the uncomfortable truth that makes this story genuinely strange. Setting aside the devil worship and the obscene kissing, Philip's financial accusations were not paranoid fantasies. They were accurate descriptions of something that had never existed before. The Templar commanderies were stone fortresses scattered across Christendom, from London to Jerusalem, from Portugal to Cyprus. Inside their walls, behind oak doors, reinforced with iron bands, sat strong boxes that took 3 men to lift. The boxes held silver. The boxes held gold. But more importantly, the boxes held paper. Ledgers bound in leather. Letters sealed with wax in 3 distinct layers, each layer requiring a different officer to verify. Coded accounts that tracked deposits made in one country and withdrawals made in another, all linked by reference numbers that meant nothing to anyone outside the order. The Templars were not merely hoarding treasure like dragons in chainmail. They were running something far stranger. Something that would not have a proper name for another 400 years. They had invented banking. Consider for a moment the problem of being a medieval pilgrim who wants to reach the Holy Land without being murdered for pocket change. The road to Jerusalem was roughly 2,000 miles of bandits, corrupt toll collectors, shipwrecks, and fellow travelers who might decide your purse looked heavier than your sword arm. Carrying enough gold to finance a multi-year journey was essentially volunteering to be robbed. Carrying too little meant starving somewhere in Anatolia. The mathematics of medieval travel were not encouraging. The Templars solved this problem with paper. A pilgrim in Paris could visit the temple, the Templar headquarters that gave the entire order its name. Inside, past guards who had actually fought in actual crusades, the pilgrim would deposit their travel funds with a Templar treasurer. The treasurer would count the coins, weigh them, note any clipped or debased currency, and issue a receipt. But this was not merely a receipt. It was a coded document, written in a cipher the order kept carefully standardized across all its houses. The document specified the amount deposited, assigned a reference that could be verified against the Paris ledgers, and could be presented at any Templar commandery between France and the Holy Land. The pilgrim could now travel carrying a piece of parchment instead of a sack of silver. In Marseille, if funds ran low, the pilgrim presented the document. A Templar treasurer matched the codes against duplicate records sent by courier from Paris. Money appeared. The pilgrim continued. In Acre or Jerusalem or any of the fortified Templar houses that dotted the Crusader states, the process repeated. Funds materialized from parchment as if by magic. This was not charity. The Templars understood that no institution survives on goodwill alone. Transaction fees applied. The order called them donations, contributions to the holy cause of protecting Christendom. The parchment did not specify exactly how much would be available at the far end, merely that funds would be provided based on the original deposit minus expenses incurred in the transfer. These expenses proved remarkably flexible. The exchange rate between currencies shifted depending on which commandery handled the withdrawal. Administrative costs appeared and disappeared based on factors known only to Templar accountants. The pilgrims paid these fees gladly. The alternative was death by banditry. And so, without anyone quite naming what had happened, money began moving across borders without physically moving at all. Gold sat in a Parisian vault while silver emerged in Jerusalem. The Templars had not merely invented a service. They had invented the concept of international wire transfer, roughly 8 centuries before the wire. The medieval church was very clear on the subject of lending money at interest. Do not. Usury was a mortal sin. Dante placed usurers in the 7th circle of hell, below murderers. Canon law forbade Christians from charging any interest whatsoever on loans, because money was supposed to be sterile. A cow could produce calves. A field could grow wheat. But a gold coin sitting in a box could not, by any natural process, produce more gold coins. To demand interest was to demand payment for something that did not exist. It was, theologically speaking, fraud against nature itself. This created certain practical difficulties for anyone trying to run an economy. The Templars, being practical men who had spent decades balancing holy missions against logistical realities, found solutions. Multiple solutions. A creative abundance of solutions that all somehow avoided using the word interest while achieving identical results. Currency exchange was the most elegant mechanism. A borrower in Paris needed 100 livres. The Templars provided 100 livres. The loan documents specified repayment of 1 livres, because charging interest would be a sin. However, the repayment was due in London in English silver pennies at an exchange rate determined by the Templars at the time of repayment. Strange how that exchange rate consistently favored the lender. Strange how the effective cost of borrowing 100 livres and repaying the equivalent amount in London always worked out to roughly 10 or 15% above the original sum. Gifts provided another avenue. The loan was interest-free, naturally. But the borrower was encouraged to make a voluntary donation to the order upon repayment. The suggested donation amounts were written into the loan documents. The donations were not technically mandatory. The Templars simply declined to do future business with borrowers who proved insufficiently generous. Shell commanderies added layers of deniability. A loan originated in the Paris Temple. Repayment was due to the London Temple. If anyone asked awkward questions, the transaction involved 2 separate houses of the order conducting independent financial operations that merely happened to correspond. The debtor borrowed from one entity and repaid another. No single commandery charged interest. That the order as a whole profited was simply the mysterious workings of legitimate commerce. The Church knew. The Vatican had eyes and accountants and was not staffed exclusively by the naive. Kings knew. They were the ones borrowing. But the Templars were useful. They defended the Holy Land. They maintained roads. They provided services no one else could offer. And so everyone agreed, without quite saying so, that whatever the Templars were doing with their exchange rates and their voluntary donations and their multi-jurisdictional loan structures, it certainly was not usury. The silence was comfortable for everyone. Until it wasn't. Kings have a recurring problem throughout history. Their expenses tend to outrun their revenues, usually because wars are expensive and conquering things rarely pays for itself as quickly as anticipated. Medieval kings had an additional problem. They could not simply borrow from anyone. Lending to a monarch required resources that most individuals and institutions did not possess. It required liquidity, meaning actual cash available immediately rather than wealth tied up in land or goods. It required presence across multiple territories, because kings needed money in various places simultaneously. And it required a certain tolerance for risk, because when your debtor commands armies and can simply choose not to repay, the collection process becomes complicated. The Templars met all these criteria. Their commandery network meant gold could appear in London, Paris, Acre, or anywhere else a king might need it. Their religious status meant they could not be easily robbed or intimidated, even by royalty. Attacking the Templars meant attacking the Church, and even the most ambitious monarch thought twice before that particular sin. Philip IV of France borrowed extensively. The precise amounts are difficult to reconstruct because many of the records were destroyed, possibly deliberately, during events we will discuss shortly. But the scale was enormous. Philip financed wars against England, wars against Flanders, wars against various Italian bankers who had the poor judgment to demand repayment of earlier debts. Each conflict required more cash. Each loan came from the only institution that could provide it. England's kings were equally entangled. The crown jewels of England spent periods locked in Templar vaults as collateral for loans. This was not a figure of speech. The literal crown jewels, including the coronation regalia, sat in Templar strongboxes while English kings scrambled to find repayment funds. The sound of Templar finance was distinctive. The clink of silver in leather pouches carried by armed escorts into royal treasuries. The creak of iron-bound strongboxes being opened in torchlight. The scratch of quills recording debts that kings promised themselves they would repay eventually. The Templars became the lender of last resort for Christendom's monarchs. This position brought power and influence beyond anything their military strength could have achieved. A Templar treasurer who controlled access to credit could shape policy simply by approving or denying loans. But being a king's creditor is a dangerous occupation. A merchant who lends to a king and demands repayment is an annoyance. An institution that lends to multiple kings and possesses armed fortresses across the continent is something else entirely. The Templars had made themselves indispensable. The question was whether indispensable meant safe or merely too dangerous to tolerate. The Templar commandery system stretched from Ireland to Armenia, a network of fortified houses linked by messengers, standardized procedures, and something that modern analysts would recognize immediately: a unified accounting system. Every commandery maintained records in identical formats. Income and expenditure were logged according to templates distributed from the order's central administration. Quarterly reports traveled between houses, sealed with wax that required 3 separate officers to authenticate. Deviations from standard practice were investigated. Treasurers who could not explain discrepancies were replaced. This bureaucratic discipline existed because the Templars had learned, through painful experience, that religious devotion does not prevent accounting fraud. Human nature being what it is, some Knight brothers proved as tempted by accessible gold as any secular treasurer. The solution was audit infrastructure that would not look out of place in a modern corporation. But standardized accounting created something else, something the Templars may not have fully intended. It created an intelligence network. Commandery reports included local economic conditions. Crop yields affected how much food could be purchased for how many coins. Currency quality mattered, because debased silver from one mint was worth less than pure silver from another. Commodity prices fluctuated based on weather, war, and whether the local lord had decided to impose new taxes. All this information flowed back through the network. A Templar treasurer in Paris, reviewing quarterly reports, knew which regions faced famine before any single merchant could have traveled far enough to learn. He knew which currencies were stable and which were being secretly clipped by desperate monarchs. He knew which nobles were overextended, which cities were prospering, which trade routes were safe. This was not mysticism. This was market intelligence aggregated from hundreds of sources across a continent, available to an organization with the infrastructure to collect and compare it. Conspiracy theorists of the era whispered about Templar secret meetings where forbidden knowledge passed between hooded figures. The reality was considerably less dramatic and considerably more effective. The real secrets were quarterly audits. The real forbidden knowledge was depreciation schedules and exchange rate trends. The real power was knowing that Portuguese grain prices would rise 3 months before anyone in Portugal realized it. The Templars used this information for internal purposes, managing their own extensive agricultural holdings and timing their currency conversions. But information, once possessed, tends to influence decisions. And Templar decisions influenced economies. When people accuse the order of knowing things they should not know, of having insight into events before they occurred, of operating a conspiracy that spanned Christendom, they were describing, without understanding it, the competitive advantage of superior data collection. The devil had nothing to do with it. Bookkeeping was sufficient. King Philip IV needed money. This was not unusual for kings, but Philip's need had become acute. Wars against England and Flanders had drained his treasury. Previous solutions, including expelling the Jews of France and seizing their assets, had provided only temporary relief. The Italian banking houses who had once lent freely were now reluctant, some of them having experienced what happened to creditors who pressed Philip too hard for repayment. The Templars held Philip's debts. The Templars possessed fortified commanderies full of gold. The Templars had made the mistake of being owed money by a man who controlled the French legal system. The arrests of October 1307 were coordinated with military precision. Royal agents struck simultaneously across France to prevent warning from spreading. The charge sheets had been prepared in advance, distributed in sealed packets with instructions not to open until the appointed hour. Philip had learned from previous attempts to move against powerful institutions. Speed and surprise mattered. The charges were designed not for plausibility but for spectacle. Devil worship, ritual sodomy, spitting on the cross, worshipping cats. The accusations were so bizarre, so theatrical, that they dominated public attention while the real work happened quietly. Templar archives were seized. Financial records, loan documents, account ledgers all passed into royal possession. The debts Philip owed the order became difficult to verify once the only records were controlled by the debtor. Torture produced confessions. This surprised no one who understood medieval judicial procedure. Sufficient application of pain could produce confessions to virtually anything. Templars admitted to idol worship. They admitted to kissing each other during initiation ceremonies. They admitted to whatever their interrogators wanted to hear because the alternative was more torture. The Grand Master Jacques de Molay initially confessed under torture, then recanted, then was slowly burned over a charcoal fire when he refused to confess again. The execution took hours. Witnesses reported that de Molay maintained his innocence and the order's innocence until the flames finally silenced him. Pope Clement V, who theoretically had authority over this military religious order, found himself pressured by Philip into dissolving the Templars entirely. The papal bull Vox and Excelso suppressed the order in 1312. Templar assets across Europe were transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, except in France, where they somehow ended up under royal control. Philip's debts vanished. The institution that held them no longer existed. The records that might have proven those debts had been seized by the debtor himself. It was the cleanest debt restructuring in medieval history, requiring only the destruction of an entire religious order and the execution of its leadership. Contemporaries understood what had happened. Dante, writing shortly after, placed Philip among the persecutors of Christ. The poet knew a financial crime when he saw one, even when dressed in the language of heresy. Here is the uncomfortable conclusion that medieval chroniclers could not quite articulate and modern historians sometimes overlook. The conspiracy theorists were right. Not about the devil worship. Not about the idol called Baphomet, which was likely a garbled version of the name Mahomet, produced by interrogators who wanted exotic-sounding heresy. Not about the ritual spitting on crosses, which appears in no Templar document and makes no sense for an order that existed specifically to defend Christianity. But about everything else. A secretive religious organization did control international finance across Christendom. Their coded communications did carry secrets that affected economies and kingdoms. They did influence monarchs through debt obligations that created political leverage. They did operate a parallel financial system outside the control of any single king or territory. They did know things about markets and currencies that ordinary merchants could not access. The paranoid accusations, stripped of their demonic window dressing, were descriptions of international banking. The secret rituals were auditing procedures. The hidden communications were quarterly reports. The mysterious power over kings was compound interest by another name. The Templars' real heresy was inventing capitalism 4 centuries before anyone was ready for it. They created instruments and institutions that the economy needed, but that theology condemned. They solved practical problems in ways that violated theoretical principles. They were too successful at activities that were not supposed to be possible. Their methods survived their destruction. Italian banking houses, particularly the Florentine families who rose to prominence in the 14th century, adopted techniques suspiciously similar to Templar practices. Letters of credit, multi-branch accounting, currency exchange as disguised interest, the information advantages of distributed networks. The Medici did not invent these mechanisms. They inherited them from an organization that could no longer object. The modern conspiracy theorist who insists that shadowy banking interests control governments, manipulate currencies, and possess information unavailable to ordinary citizens is not describing a paranoid fantasy. They are describing banking. They are describing exactly what banking does. The only difference between their accusations and reality is that reality lacks the satisfying narrative of evil cabals meeting in torchlit chambers. The torchlit chambers are fluorescent-lit conference rooms. The secret symbols are proprietary trading algorithms. The hidden communications are encrypted financial data feeds. The conspiracy is just the economy, operating as designed. Philip IV killed his creditors because he owed them money he could not repay. This remains a recurring theme in financial history, though subsequent creditor eliminations have typically been more subtle. Debts that become too large create incentives for debtors to eliminate the institution holding those debts. The Templars learned this lesson. Their spiritual successors in banking learned to distribute risk, cultivate political protection, and avoid becoming quite so convenient a target. The Templars are gone. Their commanderies are ruins or tourist attractions. Their secrets have been picked over by centuries of historians, novelists, and enthusiasts searching for holy grails and ark-like artifacts. But every time someone deposits money in one city and withdraws it in another, every time a loan document specifies repayment in a different currency with adjusted exchange rates, every time financial information travels faster than physical goods, the Templars' real legacy continues. They invented the thing we now call normal. Their reward was to be burned alive for heresy. Some innovations are not forgiven in their own time. Most girls in 1760s King China learned to embroider. Wang Zhenyi learned to read star charts. She was born in Anhui province in 1768 into a family that should have produced a perfectly unremarkable woman. Her grandfather had been a provincial governor. Her father was a scholar who had failed the imperial examinations so many times that he eventually gave up and started wandering instead, dragging his peculiar daughter across the empire like intellectual luggage. It was, by all accounts, a terrible way to raise a proper young lady. It was an extraordinary way to raise a scientist. The family traveled constantly. Libraries in Jiangsu. Military arsenals in Shaanxi. Scholarly households where old men debated cosmology over tea that had gone cold hours ago. Little Zhenyi absorbed it all, her child's mind soaking up astronomical charts and mathematical treatises the way other girls absorbed lessons about household management. Her grandmother made things stranger still. The old woman had trained in martial arts during an era when such things were deeply unfashionable for women of her class. She taught young Zhenyi to ride horses, to handle weapons, to move through the world as if she had every right to be there. The girl learned to shoot arrows before she learned to properly serve tea. And then, around age 6, came the binding. Small feet were beautiful. Small feet were proper. Small feet meant hobbling through life on broken bones wrapped in silk, every step a negotiation with pain. The process took years. The results lasted forever. Wang Zhenyi's feet were crushed into the approved shape, and she would spend the rest of her short life standing on agony to stare at the stars. But here is the thing about binding feet. It constrains the body. It does not, no matter how tightly wrapped, constrain the mind. And Wang Zhenyi's mind was already racing far beyond anywhere her feet could carry her. The study was cold. It was always cold. Winter in Qing China meant ink that froze in its stone, breath that hung visible in the air, fingers that had to be warmed by candle flame before they could hold a brush steady enough to write. The candles themselves were rationed. Light cost money. So did heat. Knowledge apparently was supposed to be free, but the tools required to pursue it added up quickly. Wang Zhenyi studied anyway. By her teenage years, she had accumulated a library that would have scandalized any respectable household. Astronomy, mathematics, geography, military strategy. These were not subjects for women. These were not even subjects for most men, who were too busy memorizing Confucian classics for examinations to bother with anything so practical as understanding how the world actually worked. But the Jesuits had brought something strange to China: European mathematics, Euclidean geometry. The idea that the universe operated according to rules that could be written down, calculated, predicted. Their translations circulated among scholars who found themselves increasingly uncomfortable with the implications. If the heavens followed mathematical laws, what room was left for divine whim? Zhenyi read everything she could find. She cross-referenced Chinese astronomical traditions with European methods. She compared ancient calculations to her own observations. And slowly, in that freezing study, with her breath clouding the pages and her bound feet aching beneath her, she realized something that would shape the rest of her life. The ancient texts were wrong. Not wrong in small ways. Not wrong in the forgivable manner of scholars working with limited tools. Wrong in ways that had calcified into dogma, errors repeated so often they had become truth. The revered astronomical authorities that everyone quoted had made mistakes. And nobody was checking. Nobody was questioning. They were simply copying, generation after generation, the same beautiful, useless errors. Wang Zhenyi was 17 years old, female, and increasingly convinced she could do better. The demonstration was almost embarrassingly simple. That was the point. Wang Zhenyi was 25 years old when she set up her apparatus in her father's study. A round table. A lamp positioned to represent the sun. A circular mirror suspended at the center, standing in for the earth. And a crystal ball which she would move along a careful path to serve as the moon. Outside, respectable scholars were still debating whether lunar eclipses represented divine displeasure. whether the heavens were trying to communicate moral failures, whether emperors should perform rituals to appease whatever cosmic forces had swallowed the moon. Inside, a woman with bound feet and insufficient candles was about to render all of that nonsense irrelevant. She lit the lamp. The light fell across the table, casting shadows exactly where geometry predicted shadows should fall. She moved the crystal ball along its orbital path and watched the darkness slide across its surface as it passed through the Earth's shadow. There was no mystery. There was no divine message. There was only a sphere blocking light from reaching another sphere, as predictable as a cart blocking a road. The eclipse was a shadow. Nothing more. Nothing less. Nothing that required priests or sacrifices or imperial anxiety. Her feet throbbed. They always throbbed after standing for extended periods, the crushed bones protesting their imprisonment. She had been at this for hours, adjusting angles, taking notes, confirming that the mathematics matched the demonstration matched the actual recorded observations of eclipses past. They did. They all did. She wrote it down, published it, explained it in language clear enough that anyone with a lamp and a ball could replicate the experiment themselves. Meanwhile, across China, her male contemporaries were earning honors for carefully transcribing ancient authorities without questioning a single word. They received positions, stipends, recognition. Wang Zhenyi received the particular silence that greets women who are correct about things they were never supposed to understand. The gods apparently were not interested in being disproved by household objects. Neither were the scholars who had built careers on divine unpredictability. But the crystal ball kept casting shadows. The mathematics kept working, and Wang Zhenyi kept writing, because what else could she do? The truth was the truth, even if nobody wanted to hear it from her. She published under her own name. This was either brave or foolish, depending on who you asked. Male scholars who wanted to be taken seriously sometimes adopted pen names to avoid accusations of vanity. Female scholars who wanted to be taken seriously did not exist according to conventional wisdom, so the question of pen names was moot. Wang Zhenyi simply signed her work and let the chips fall where they may. The chips fell into a polite void. Her treatises on spherical trigonometry were rigorous. Her corrections to traditional calendar calculations were mathematically sound. Her explanations of Pythagorean theorems, adapted for Chinese readers, were clearer than the Jesuit translations she had learned from. She wrote about gravity, about the movement of celestial bodies, about the geometry that governed everything from artillery trajectories to the rising of the tides. And she wrote poetry. This, at least, was acceptable. Women could write poetry. It was decorative, emotional, safely feminine. But Wang Zhenyi's poetry was strange. Her verses explained astronomical concepts in language that ordinary readers could understand. They made complex mathematics accessible to people who would never open a technical treatise. They were, in effect, science communication disguised as art. One of her poems declared that men and women were equally capable of intellectual achievement. This was not decorative. This was not safely feminine. This was a woman who had proven the gods wrong now, suggesting that perhaps the social order needed similar scrutiny. the response was instructive. Her scientific work was largely ignored. Her mathematical corrections were not incorporated into official calendars. Her astronomical demonstrations did not replace superstition in imperial policy. But her poems, properly feminine poems, were preserved and circulated as charming curiosities, evidence that women could indeed achieve a certain level of cultivation. The equations worked. The equations were not what people wanted to remember. Somewhere in Qing, China, a man who had contributed nothing original was receiving a position at an imperial observatory. His qualification was that he had beautifully transcribed texts that were 3 centuries old and contained errors that Wang Zhenyi had already identified. This is what success looked like for men. Wang Zhenyi's success looked like writing more, faster, hoping that volume might eventually overcome the disadvantage of being correct while female. Zhenyi was, by the standards of the time, a deeply unusual husband. He was a scholar himself, which was ordinary enough. He had ambitions, examinations to pass, a career to build, all the normal concerns of educated men in Qing China. What made him unusual was that he married a woman who had already published scientific treatises, and instead of asking her to stop, he asked her to continue. They shared a study. This alone was remarkable. The space filled with books belonged to both of them, his classical texts mixing with her astronomical charts, his brush practicing calligraphy while hers calculated orbital periods. They argued about mathematics. They compared observations. They lived, for a brief period, as something close to intellectual equals. The money was never good. Brilliant, unconventional women did not attract wealthy patrons. Supportive, unconventional husbands did not climb bureaucratic ladders efficiently. They scraped by on his modest positions and her even more modest recognition, 2 scholars trying to survive on ideas in a world that valued connections. Wang Zhenyi wrote more. She seemed to understand, somehow, that time was short. Her output during the marriage years was furious. Treatise after treatise, poem after poem, as if she were racing against something she could feel approaching, but not yet name. Her health had never been robust. The years of inadequate nutrition, freezing studies, and constant physical strain were accumulating. The bound feet that had carried her through astronomical observations were failing faster than feet should fail in a woman not yet 30. But she kept writing. And Zhenyi kept supporting. And for a little while, in a small study filled with star charts and the smell of ink, 2 people managed to build something that looked almost like a partnership. It would not last. Nothing Wang Zhenyi built would last long enough. But for those few years, at least she was not alone. The medicines did not work. They rarely did. Qing dynasty medical knowledge had its strengths, but treating whatever was consuming Wang Zhenyi from the inside was not among them. She was 28, then 29, and her body was failing in ways that no amount of intelligence could outmaneuver. The cold seeped through the walls that winter. It always had, but now she felt it more sharply, her weakened constitution no longer able to generate enough heat to fight back. The ink had to be warmed more frequently. The brush in her hand trembled in ways it never had before. The careful astronomical notations she had made her reputation on became increasingly difficult to produce. She organized her manuscripts with the focus of someone who understood exactly what was happening. Years of original research. Treatises on mathematics, astronomy, geography. Poetry that made science accessible. Corrections to ancient errors that official scholars still refuse to acknowledge. All of it stacked and sorted and prepared for a future she would not see. Her friend Kuei Joey received the bulk of it. This was trust of an extraordinary kind, handing unpublished work to someone with instructions to preserve it, knowing that you would not be alive to ensure that it happened. Kuei promised. Wang Zhenyi had to accept that promises were the best she could hope for. She died in 1797, 29 years old, the same age at which other scholars were just beginning to produce work that would be taken seriously. The age at which careers were supposed to start, not end. The study fell silent. The star charts gathered dust. The crystal ball that had disproved divine eclipses sat on a shelf, ordinary now, waiting for someone to pick it up and understand what it had demonstrated. Mostly no one did. Most of her manuscripts were lost in the years that followed, the way women's work tends to get lost when there is no institution obligated to preserve it. What survived were fragments. Poems, mostly. The safely feminine parts. The equations were the first to go. In 1854, a scholar compiling biographies of notable Qing women included Wang Zhenyi. She was described as accomplished in poetry and painting, with some interest in astronomy. The mathematical treatises were not mentioned. The eclipse demonstration was not mentioned. The corrections to ancient errors that male scholars still refused to make were not mentioned. She had become, in death, the acceptable kind of female achievement. Decorative. Harmless. Interesting for a woman. The men who came after her did worse work. They copied the same ancient texts she had identified as erroneous. They performed the same rituals for eclipses that she had proven were geometric inevitabilities. They received positions at observatories, honors from emperors, places in history. Their names survived. Their work survived. Their errors survived. Hers became a footnote. In 1994, 197 years after her death, the International Astronomical Union named a crater on Venus after Wang Zhenyi. The honor was sincere. It was also deeply strange, this recognition of astronomical achievement for a woman whose astronomical achievements we can no longer fully read. The manuscripts that would have told us exactly what she calculated, exactly what she proved, exactly how far ahead of her time she really was, are gone. We know she demonstrated that eclipses were shadows. We know she wrote about spherical trigonometry. We know she corrected calendar calculations. We know from fragments and references that she was doing original work while her contemporaries were copying. But the details, the proofs, the equations themselves, did not survive the long indifference that followed her death. A crater on Venus, named for a woman who proved the gods wrong with a lamp and a crystal ball. Named for work we can no longer verify, contributions we can only gesture toward, a mind we can only imagine. She was right. The universe does follow mathematical laws. Eclipses are predictable shadows. The heavens do not communicate moral messages. Everything she demonstrated has been confirmed 1,000 times over by scientists who never learned her name. Her equations worked. Her footnote status was the only thing that survived. Somewhere in whatever afterlife astronomers believe in, Wang Zhenyi might appreciate the irony. She spent her life proving that the universe was not governed by divine whim, only to have her legacy governed by something even more arbitrary, the whim of men who decided what was worth remembering. The crater on Venus is 40 kilometers wide. It is the largest memorial she will ever receive. And it circles a planet that no one in 1797 could see clearly, named for a goddess of love, honoring a woman who loved only truth and got exactly as much of it as her world was willing to give her. Which was never, ever enough.